October 24, 1944. Philippine Sea, 210 miles east of Leyte Gulf. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto's hand trembled as he penciled his final combat report, knowing it would never reach Tokyo. Through the canopy of his damaged A6M0, he had just witnessed something that violated every principle of carrier aviation doctrine he had learned at Kasumigara Air Base. American Task Force launches wave exceeding 100 aircraft in 18 minutes. Impossible by all known carrier operations theory. Either our intelligence is catastrophically wrong, or the Americans have achieved something beyond our comprehension. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His radio crackled with panicked transmissions from his squadron mates. Not panic from combat, panic from witnessing mathematical impossibility. 4 American carriers below them were simultaneously launching aircraft at a rate that defied everything Japanese naval aviation understood about deck operations, fuel management, and organizational coordination. In the 18 minutes Yamamoto's formation had taken to climb to attack altitude, the American carriers had transformed from stationary targets into floating airfields that vomited forth an aerial armada. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, all launching in coordinated waves with mechanical precision that seemed inhuman. The sky darkened with American aircraft until individual planes became impossible to count. The Japanese Naval Air Force had been built on a doctrine of elite pilot supremacy and carrier strike capability refined through years of training. What Yamamoto witnessed that morning wasn't just tactical superiority, it was systematic organizational dominance so complete that Japanese carrier doctrine, forged in triumph at Pearl Harbor, became obsolete in the time it took to launch a single squadron. This is the true story of how Japanese naval aviators discovered that American Essex-Class carriers weren't just larger vessels, but integrated weapon systems capable of launching coordinated strikes at speeds that rendered traditional carrier tactics suicidal. The revelation would come through combat encounters so one-sided that survival itself became evidence of American technological and organizational supremacy the Imperial Japanese Navy never anticipated. 1936–1941. Kasumigara Naval Air Base, Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier doctrine was forged in the belief that superior pilot skill and aggressive tactics would overcome any material disadvantage. At Kasumigara, the Navy's premier flight training facility, cadets endured the most rigorous aviation training program in the world. Of every 1,500 applicants, fewer than 100 graduated. Those who did became the finest carrier pilots on Earth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Flight Officer Kenji Nakamura's training diary, preserved in the Japanese National Archives, documents the philosophy that shaped Japanese naval aviation. We are taught that one superior Japanese pilot equals 10 enemy pilots. Our carriers need not match American numbers. We need only maintain pilot quality and strike coordination. Speed comes from practice. Precision comes from discipline. Victory comes from spirit. Japanese carrier operations in 1941 represented the pinnacle of carrier warfare evolution. At Pearl Harbor, 6 carriers of the Kido Butai launched 183 aircraft in the first wave, a feat requiring 45 minutes of coordinated deck operations. This was considered exceptional performance, the result of years of training and operational refinement. The process was intricate. Aircraft positioned on deck, engines warmed, pilots briefed, fuel loads verified, ordnance checked, and launches coordinated with wind conditions. Each carrier in the fleet operated as an independent unit, launching its aircraft in carefully timed sequences. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, could launch 18 aircraft in 12 minutes under optimal conditions, a rate considered outstanding by 1941 standards. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, wrote in his operational report, "Our carrier launch procedures represent the highest evolution of naval aviation. Through training and discipline, we achieve coordination that mechanical systems cannot match. American carriers, larger but less refined, will never match our operational tempo." This confidence was built on combat success. In the early months of 1942, Japanese carriers struck throughout the Pacific with devastating effectiveness. The British Eastern Fleet was mauled in the Indian Ocean. Port Darwin was obliterated. Ceylon was raided. Japanese carrier groups operated with impunity, their launch and recovery procedures refined to textbook precision. But this doctrine contained a fatal assumption, that carrier aviation would remain an art rather than becoming a science, that coordination would remain dependent on highly trained individuals rather than systematized procedures, that American industrial capacity would never translate into operational superiority. Flight Officer Hiroshi Takano, who survived the war to write extensively about Japanese naval aviation, later reflected, "We believed carrier operations were like sword-making, a craft perfected through dedication and spirit. We never imagined the Americans would treat it like automobile manufacturing, systematizing what we considered art." 1942-1943. Imperial Japanese Naval Intelligence Section, Tokyo. Japanese naval intelligence tracked American carrier construction with growing concern, but completely failed to understand what Essex-Class carriers represented. Intelligence reports, declassified in the 1970s, reveal systematic underestimation of American organizational innovation. A September 1942 intelligence assessment stated, "Americans constructing new carrier class designated Essex. Estimated displacement 27,000 tons. Aircraft complement 80 to 90. Larger than our fleet carriers, but following conventional design philosophy. Construction time estimated at 36 months per vessel. Threat level, moderate by 1945. Every aspect of this assessment proved catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, assigned to intelligence analysis before returning to flight status, reviewed American carrier reports with increasing unease. The numbers from our submarine observations didn't align with conventional carrier doctrine. Reports of 90 to 100 aircraft aboard vessels of stated size. Either our intelligence was flawed, or Americans had fundamentally restructured carrier operations. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp was that Essex-class carriers weren't just larger versions of existing designs. They were integrated weapons systems built around mass aviation operations. The Americans had revolutionized deck layout, aircraft handling, fuel systems, ordnance handling, and launch coordination. Every aspect was systematized for maximum throughput. The Essex-class hangar deck could hold aircraft on 2 levels, with elevators capable of moving planes to the flight deck in under 30 seconds. Fuel lines ran throughout the ship, allowing simultaneous refueling of dozens of aircraft. Ordnance handling systems used mechanical conveyors to move bombs and torpedoes directly to waiting aircraft. The flight deck was divided into precisely marked zones for aircraft positioning, with deck crews trained to move planes like parts on an assembly line. Most critically, the Americans had developed Doctrine for simultaneous launches from multiple spots on the flight deck. Rather than launching aircraft sequentially from a single catapult, Essex-class carriers could launch from 2 catapults, while additional aircraft took off under their own power from the aft deck. With sufficient wind over the deck, an Essex-class carrier could launch 10 aircraft per minute, a rate Japanese intelligence deemed physically impossible. "We calculated the deck space limited launch rates," wrote Commander Shigeru Nishimura, a carrier operations specialist. "We assumed Americans would face the same constraints we did,
positioning aircraft, warming engines, verifying systems. We never imagined they would treat aircraft like bullets in a machine gun, systematically feeding them into the air without pause. Japanese carriers continued to improve their procedures, reducing launch times through practice. By 1943, the Shokaku could launch 20 aircraft in 15 minutes, considered excellent performance. Intelligence estimates suggested American carriers might achieve similar rates once crew training improved. The actual capability was triple that rate. And the Japanese would discover this not through intelligence reports, but through combat that left survivors to bear witness to American organizational superiority.
June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Saipan. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. For Japanese naval aviators, it was the day their entire understanding of carrier warfare collapsed. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with 450 aircraft, the largest Japanese carrier force since Midway. His plan was classic Japanese doctrine: find the American carriers, launch massive strikes, achieve decisive victory through superior pilot skill and coordination. His opponent, Admiral Mark Mitzcher, commanded 15 carriers of Task Force 58. 7 were Essex-Class vessels. His force carried over 900 aircraft, but numbers alone didn't explain what was about to happen. Lieutenant Hideaki Sato led a 9-plane formation from the carrier Zuikaku in the first attack wave. His mission briefing indicated American carriers were approximately 180 miles distant, within strike range, but requiring careful fuel management for the return journey. "We launched at 0830 hours, Sato recorded in his after-action report. 45 minutes to position all aircraft and achieve coordinated departure. Standard procedure. We climbed to attack altitude, expecting to surprise American carriers in the process of launching their own strikes. What Sato's formation encountered at 1,000 hours shattered that expectation. The American task force was visible from 60 miles, not because of ships, but because of the number of aircraft already airborne. The sky was filled with them, fighters in layered formations from 10,000 to 25,000 feet. We assumed they had launched their strike force, and we were encountering their combat air patrol. Then we saw the carriers below. They were still launching aircraft. Not scattered launches, coordinated waves. As we watched from altitude, aircraft rose from their decks in continuous streams. 10 aircraft, 20, 30. The count became impossible. And this was not all their carriers. This was just the ones visible to our formation. Sato's squadron never reached attack distance. American F-6F Hellcats from the Essex and Lexington intercepted them at 22,000 feet. The combat lasted 11 minutes. Of Sato's 9 aircraft, 6 were destroyed. He and 2 others dove away, barely reaching cloud cover. But the combat wasn't what haunted Sato. It was what he observed during those 11 minutes of desperate evasion. Below us, the American carriers never stopped launching aircraft. While we fought for our lives, while my squadron mates died around me, those carriers continued putting planes into the air with mechanical precision. They weren't reacting to our attack. They were simply executing pre-planned operations that our arrival couldn't disrupt. I counted launches from 1 carrier during our engagement, 16 aircraft in the time we fought. Fighters, dive bombers, more fighters, launched, climbing away, forming up. The coordination was inhuman. This was not skill. This was system. The full horror of Philippine Sea emerged in the statistics that Japanese commanders could barely comprehend. Of the 450 aircraft launched against Task Force 58, approximately 330 were destroyed. American losses, 30 aircraft, with most pilots recovered. But the numbers that truly revealed American capability were the launch statistics, reconstructed from American action reports that Japanese survivors read after the war. Task Force 58's 7 Essex-Class carriers launched 226 aircraft in the first defensive response. accomplished in approximately 22 minutes across the force. Individual carriers achieved rates of 30 to 35 aircraft in 15 minutes. The USS Lexington launched 37 aircraft in 17 minutes, while simultaneously recovering damaged fighters from earlier patrols. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto survived Philippine Sea by remaining with the Japanese carrier force rather than flying in the strikes. From the Zuikaku's bridge, he watched the Japanese launch operations with new understanding. We launched 150 aircraft from 3 fleet carriers over 90 minutes. This represented our finest coordination. Every procedure executed perfectly. Every pilot launched efficiently. We achieved tempo we believed was the maximum possible. Then, we received reports from the strike force. The Americans had launched more than twice that number in less than 1/4 the time. The mathematics made no sense. We assumed exaggerated reports from pilots in combat stress, but multiple formations reported the same observations. American carriers launching aircraft continuously, without pause, in numbers that exceeded their supposed aircraft complement. The reality was worse than reports indicated. Essex-Class carriers carried 90 to 100 aircraft as standard complement, but could surge to 110 to 120 by packing additional planes on deck and in hangar spaces. More critically, their systematized launch procedures meant they could put their entire air group into the sky in under 30 minutes under combat conditions. Japanese carriers required nearly 2 hours to launch, recover, rearm, and launch again. American carriers could complete the same cycle in 70 minutes. In a sustained battle, this meant American carriers could fly twice as many sorties with the same number of aircraft, effectively doubling their combat power through organizational efficiency rather than numbers alone.
Among the American carriers at Philippine Sea, the USS Essex became legendary among Japanese survivors for demonstrations of launch capability that seemed impossible. Lieutenant Saburo Nakano, one of the few pilots who survived multiple encounters with Task Force 58, fixated on the Essex in particular. His combat reports, written with increasingly desperate precision, documented his observations. June 19th, 09:47 hours. Engaged F-6F fighters over American carrier identified as Essex. During 12-minute combat, observed carrier below launching aircraft continuously. Counted 27 launches while evading enemy fighters. This from single carrier. June 20th, 14:23 hours. Returned toward American fleet to observe during dusk. Watched Essex from 18 miles distance, outside of engagement range. Carrier launching final patrol fighters while simultaneously recovering strike aircraft on aft deck. Launch and recovery operations occurring simultaneously on same vessel. Counted 18 launches during 40 minutes of observation. Never stopped, never paused. Mechanical precision. What Nakano couldn't know was that Essex-Class carriers were designed specifically for this capability. The flight deck was divided into operational zones. Forward catapults launched aircraft, while the aft deck recovered incoming planes. The angled section allowed simultaneous operations that Japanese carriers, with straight decks requiring the entire surface for each operation, could never match. The deck crews were the invisible weapon. American carrier deck operations employed 80 to 100 specially trained personnel who moved aircraft, positioned planes, handled fuel lines, loaded ordnance, and coordinated launches with choreographed precision. They wore color-coded jerseys, yellow for aircraft directors, red for ordnance handlers, purple for fueling, blue for tractor operators, allowing instant visual identification of responsibilities. This systematization meant deck operations continued even when individual crew members were killed or wounded. The system absorbed casualties and continued functioning. Japanese carriers relied more heavily on individual expertise, meaning the loss of key personnel disrupted operations. The Americans had mechanized what we considered art, wrote Commander Shigeru Nishimura after studying captured training manuals. Their deck crews followed procedural manuals, hundreds of pages long, every movement mapped, every position defined, every timing specified. They trained not for perfection, but for reliability, not for speed in ideal conditions, but for sustained tempo under combat damage.
July, August 1944. Surviving Japanese carriers withdrew to Kure Naval Base. The remnants of Japan's carrier force gathered for repair and reconstitution. Of the 9 carriers that sortied for Philippine Sea, 4 were sunk by submarines during the withdrawal. The remaining 5 carriers had lost most of their aircraft and pilots. Captain Toshiyuki Yokoi, Air Operations Officer for Carrier Division 3, compiled after-action reports from surviving pilots. The testimony revealed systematic misunderstanding of American capabilities. Pilots report American carrier groups launching 80 to 120 aircraft in 15 to 25 minutes, initially dismissed as combat exaggeration. However, multiple independent observations from different formations at different times confirm similar numbers. Must conclude reports are accurate. Analysis indicates Americans have achieved launch rates 3 to 4 times our maximum capability. This advantage cannot be overcome through pilot training or tactical innovation. This is systematic organizational superiority that renders our carrier doctrine obsolete. A planning session in early August examined options for continued carrier operations. The discussion, preserved in naval records, shows the recognition of defeat. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto presented calculated comparisons. American Essex-Class carriers achieved 30 aircraft launches in 15 minutes. Our fleet carriers achieved 20 aircraft in 15 minutes at peak efficiency. In sustained operations, Americans can launch twice as many sorties per day. This doubles their effective combat power regardless of pilot skill. Additionally, American carriers demonstrate ability to conduct simultaneous launch and recovery operations. Our carriers must cease all launches during recovery, then clear deck to resume launching. The Americans never stop. They are not carriers as we understand them. They are floating airfields with infinite operational tempo. The implications were stated bluntly. Carrier-to-carrier combat against American task forces is no longer viable. Japanese carriers cannot generate sufficient sorties to overwhelm American defenses before being destroyed by superior sortie rates.
October 24th, 25th, 1944. Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Imperial Japanese Navy made its final carrier commitment at Leyte Gulf. 4 carriers under Admiral Ozawa were deployed as a decoy force, carrying only 116 aircraft among them, barely more than a single Essex-Class carrier. Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura flew one of the last missions from the carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving veteran of Pearl Harbor. His mission wasn't to attack American ships, but to observe and report on American carrier operations for post-war analysis. A mission that assumed Japanese personnel would survive to compile such reports. Launched 0630 hours for reconnaissance of American carrier groups east of Samar, Nakamura recorded. Observed Task Group 38.1 at distance. 6 carriers, including at least 3 Essex-Class vessels. 0730 hours. Observed carriers launching what appeared to be morning patrols. Approximately 40 aircraft launched from the task group in 12 minutes. Used binoculars to observe deck operations from 15 miles distance, outside fighter intercept range. The Americans have achieved something we never imagined. They treat carrier launches like artillery barrages. Sustained, coordinated, continuous. Their deck crews move aircraft like factory workers moving parts. No wasted motion, no pauses. Every aircraft positioned, fueled, armed, and launched with mechanical precision. Watched one Essex-Class carrier specifically, counted 13 launches in 9 minutes. Then the carrier turned into the wind and launched 10 more aircraft in 6 minutes. 23 aircraft in 15 minutes from one carrier. Our best performance was never more than 20 aircraft in that time, and that required perfect conditions and no combat damage. What Nakamura observed was Task Group 38.1 launching a strike against Japanese surface forces. A coordinated wave of 180 aircraft from 6 carriers put into the air in under 25 minutes. The mathematics of Japanese defeat had become undeniable. American carriers could generate more sorties, launch more aircraft per hour, recover and rearm faster, and sustain these operations longer than any Japanese carrier force. The organizational advantage was so complete that numerical parity would have been insufficient. Japan would have needed 2 carriers for every American carrier just to match sortie generation rates. By November 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively lost its carrier force. 4 carriers were sunk at Leyte Gulf. The surviving vessels had no aircraft, no trained pilots, and no prospect of meaningful reconstitution. In Tokyo, naval staff officers compiled final assessments of the carrier war. Commander Shigeru Nishimura, reassigned from carrier operations to planning, wrote the epitaph for Japanese carrier doctrine. American carrier superiority derives not from size, but from system. Essex-Class carriers are integrated weapons platforms designed for maximum sortie generation. Every system, aircraft elevators, fuel distribution, ordnance handling, flight deck layout, crew coordination, optimized for sustained launch operations. Our carriers were built as elite platforms for elite pilots. American carriers were built as mass aviation delivery systems. We never imagined carrier warfare would become industrial warfare. We believed in quality over quantity. The Americans achieved both. A single Essex-Class carrier can generate more combat power than 2 Japanese fleet carriers through superior sortie rates. Task Force 58, with 15 carriers, could generate more than twice the daily sorties of our entire carrier fleet. This wasn't a battle. It was systematic destruction. Flight Officer Hiroshi Takano, who survived the war after being shot down at Philippine Sea, later summarized the revelation that Japanese naval aviators experienced. We trained for 3 years to become carrier pilots. We practiced launch procedures until they were perfect. We believed our skill and dedication would overcome material disadvantages. Then we encountered American carriers at Philippine Sea and realized we had prepared for the wrong war. The Americans didn't win through better pilots, they won through better systems. Their carriers could launch 100 aircraft in the time we needed to launch 30. This wasn't about courage or skill. This was about organization and engineering. We brought swords to a gunfight, then discovered the guns were actually artillery batteries.
December 1944, March 1945. Various American prisoner of war facilities, Pacific Theater. The surviving Japanese naval aviators who became prisoners of war experienced something unexpected: direct observation of the carrier systems that had defeated them. While Geneva Convention protocols prevented their use in war production, POWs were occasionally transported aboard American vessels, including carriers conducting routine operations. Lieutenant Saburo Nakano, shot down during the Battle of Cape Engano, found himself aboard the USS Hornet, an Essex-Class carrier, during transfer from the Philippines to a POW facility in Hawaii.
The 5-day journey provided observations that completed his understanding of American carrier superiority. "I was held in a converted storage compartment near the hangar deck," Nakano wrote in his post-war memoir. "The sounds of flight operations were constant: aircraft engines, catapult launches, arresting cable impacts, elevator machinery. I kept detailed mental notes, knowing this information might prove valuable if Japan survived long enough to use it. What struck me immediately was the mechanical nature of operations. Everything moved on schedules. Launch operations occurred every 90 minutes during daylight hours. Launches took 18 to 22 minutes, then recovery operations for 15 to 20 minutes, then preparation for the next launch cycle. The precision was inhuman. The Americans had reduced carrier aviation to a manufacturing process." Through gaps in his compartment and during brief deck exercises under guard, Nakano observed the systems that made Essex-Class carriers lethal. The aircraft elevators moved with hydraulic speed, bringing planes from hangar to flight deck in under 30 seconds. Japanese carriers used slower electric elevators that took 2 to 3 minutes per cycle. This seemingly small difference meant American carriers could position aircraft on deck 3 times faster during surge operations. The fuel distribution system was even more revolutionary. Essex-Class carriers had fuel lines running throughout the hangar deck and flight deck, with quick disconnect fittings that allowed simultaneous refueling of multiple aircraft. Nakano watched deck crews fuel 8 aircraft simultaneously, a sight that would have been impossible on Japanese carriers where fueling was sequential. "The ordnance handling was what truly revealed American thinking," Nakano recorded. "They had mechanical conveyors moving bombs and torpedoes from magazines directly to aircraft parking positions. No manual carrying of heavy ordnance across the deck, no delays waiting for weapons to be positioned. The Americans had engineered every bottleneck out of the process." Most significantly, Nakao observed the deck crew coordination that made rapid launches possible. The color-coded jersey system meant every person's role was instantly identifiable. Deck operations followed choreographed procedures where each crew member knew precisely where to move, when to act, and what to do next. This systemization meant new crew members could be trained in weeks rather than months. "I realized we had approached carrier operations as an art, requiring years of experience. The Americans approached it as a science, requiring clear procedures. Their system absorbed new personnel and continued functioning. Our system depended on experienced chiefs whose loss disrupted operations. They had built a carrier force that could sustain casualties and maintain tempo. We had built a force that collapsed when key personnel were lost." 1945-1946. Captured Japanese naval officers compiled technical assessments. After Japan's surrender, American occupation authorities requested Japanese naval officers to prepare detailed analyses of carrier operations for historical documentation. These reports, declassified in the 1970s, provide remarkable insight into how Japanese professionals dissected their defeat. Commander Shigeru Nishimura, assigned to the technical analysis team, produced a 340-page report titled Comparative Analysis of American and Japanese Carrier Operations 1942-1945. The document reads like an autopsy of Japanese carrier doctrine. American Essex-Class carriers represented fundamental rethinking of carrier design philosophy. Japanese carriers were built as seagoing bases for elite air groups. Essex-Class carriers were built as aviation sortie generation machines. Every design choice prioritized launch and recovery rates. Nishimura's report cataloged specific innovations. Deck layout innovation. Essex-Class carriers used an 872-foot flight deck with precisely marked zones. Forward catapults for assisted launches, center deck for aircraft positioning,
aft deck for free takeoffs and landings. This division allowed simultaneous launch and recovery operations impossible on Japanese straight-deck carriers. Elevator speed. 3 aircraft elevators capable of 22 feet per second vertical movement. Japanese carriers averaged 8 feet per second. This threefold speed advantage meant Essex carriers could move their entire air group between hangar and flight deck in under 18 minutes. Japanese carriers required 45 to 60 minutes for the same operation. Fuel system capacity. Essex-Class carriers carried 240,000 gallons of aviation fuel in protected tanks throughout the ship. Distribution pumps could refuel the entire air group simultaneously. Japanese carriers had centralized fuel storage with manual distribution systems that created bottlenecks during rapid turnaround operations. Ordnance handling. Automated conveyor systems moved ordnance from magazines to flight deck in 4 minutes. Japanese carriers required 12 to 15 minutes using manual handling. This difference became critical during multi-wave strikes where rapid rearming determined sortie rates. Damage control. Essex-Class carriers had redundant systems for fuel, power, water, and fire suppression. Damage to one section didn't cripple the entire vessel. Japanese carriers had more vulnerable centralized systems where single hits could disable flight operations. The cumulative effect of these advantages, Nishimura concluded, was an operational tempo 3 to 4 times our maximum capability. In theoretical equal combat, same number of carriers, same aircraft quality, same pilot skill, American forces would win through superior sortie generation alone. In actual combat, they possessed additional advantages in numbers, aircraft performance, and pilot training that made defeat inevitable.
January to August 1945. The final proof of American carrier supremacy. As Japan's situation became desperate, the Navy resorted to kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks by aircraft deliberately crashed into ships. This tactical shift revealed the ultimate futility of conventional attacks against American carrier defenses. Flight officer Kenji Nakamura, who survived the war after being grounded due to injuries, studied kamikaze action reports with growing horror. The statistics told a devastating story. Kamikaze attacks represented our admission that conventional carrier strikes could not penetrate American defenses, Nakamura wrote. The mathematics were brutal. American carrier groups could maintain 50 to 80 fighters in the air continuously during daylight hours through rotating patrols. Their radar detected incoming raids at 100-plus miles. Their fighters intercepted at 50 to 70 miles from the carriers. Few Japanese aircraft penetrated to attack range. The Battle of Okinawa provided the final statistical evidence. Japanese forces launched 1,900 kamikaze sorties between April and June 1945. Of these, approximately 1,465 aircraft were destroyed before reaching attack positions. Of the 435 that penetrated to the carrier groups, 398 were destroyed by fighter defense and anti-aircraft fire. 37 aircraft achieved hits or near misses. In those same 3 months, American carriers at Okinawa flew over 43,000 combat sorties, an average of 500 sorties per day from the carriers of Task Force 58. Their sortie generation rate was so high that American carriers conducted missions far exceeding defensive necessity, striking targets across Japan, Formosa, and China simply because they had excess capacity. We had been reduced to suicide attacks because conventional strikes were mathematically futile, wrote Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, now serving in Tokyo planning suicide operations he knew were pointless. The Americans launched more sorties in a day than we could generate in a week. Their defensive fighter coverage was so thick that penetration required sacrificing the aircraft, hence kamikaze. Even then, success rates were 2 to 3%. We were witnessing systematic slaughter enabled by carrier tempo we could never match.
The most devastating statistic: during the entire Okinawa campaign, no American Essex-Class carrier was sunk despite hundreds of kamikaze attacks. Several were damaged, some severely, but all returned to service. The Essex-Class design's damage control systems and structural redundancy meant they could absorb punishment that would have sunk Japanese carriers.
September 1945-1950. Rebuilding Japanese naval aviation. After surrender, American occupation authorities authorized reconstruction of limited Japanese maritime forces for coastal defense. Former Imperial Navy officers were recruited to help establish this force, and many received training aboard American vessels. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Nakano was among those selected for American training. In 1948, he spent 6 weeks aboard USS Boxer, an Essex-class carrier, learning modern carrier procedures that would inform Japanese maritime aviation development. The Americans shared their procedures without restriction, Nakano wrote. They provided us with training manuals, operational doctrine, and technical specifications. They were confident enough in their superiority that sharing knowledge posed no threat. This generosity toward former enemies was incomprehensible by Japanese military standards. What Nakano learned during those 6 weeks transformed his understanding of naval aviation. The deck crew training program was 6 weeks long, producing qualified personnel through systematic instruction rather than the years of apprenticeship Japanese carriers required. Each position had detailed procedural manuals. Every movement was choreographed. Training emphasized team coordination over individual expertise. They showed us films of deck operations, Nakano recorded. The same launch sequence repeated dozens of times, filmed from multiple angles. They studied their own procedures clinically, identifying inefficiencies and optimizing movement patterns. This analytical approach was foreign to Japanese training, which emphasized tradition and experience. The American instructors explained the philosophy behind Essex-class design. Maximum sortie generation wasn't achieved through single innovations, but through systematic optimization of every component. Faster elevators, better fuel distribution, improved ordnance handling, optimized deck layout, systematic crew training, each improvement added 5 to 10% efficiency. Combined, they tripled operational tempo. We asked how they developed these innovations, Nakano wrote. They explained it was industrial engineering applied to naval operations. They timed every procedure, identified bottlenecks, and redesigned processes to eliminate delays. They treated carrier operations like factory production lines, a perspective we never considered. Former Commander Shigeru Mishimura, also participating in reconstruction planning, summarized the fundamental difference in approach. Japanese carrier doctrine assumed quality would overcome quantity. American doctrine proved that systematic quality produces quantity. Their carriers weren't just larger, they were better designed, better organized, and better systematized. They achieved both quality and quantity by treating carrier operations as an engineering problem rather than an art form. 1970s, 1990s. Surviving Japanese naval aviators recorded their experiences. As Japan rebuilt and the wounds of war faded, veterans began speaking openly about their wartime experiences. Their testimonies revealed the psychological impact of facing American carrier supremacy. Flight Officer Hiroshi Takano, who flew at Philippine Sea and survived being shot down, spoke at length about the moment he realized Japanese defeat was inevitable. It was watching the American carriers launch aircraft while we attacked them. We had been taught that attacking carriers during launch operations would catch them vulnerable. Aircraft on deck, fuel lines exposed, ordnance handlers busy. We expected chaos when we struck. Instead, we found organization that continued functioning under attack. While their fighters engaged us, their carriers continued launch operations without pause. They maintained systematic procedure while under fire. This discipline, this ability to execute complex operations while being attacked, revealed a level of training and organization we had never imagined. I knew then we couldn't win. not because they had better aircraft or more carriers, but because they had built a system that couldn't be disrupted. We could damage their carriers, kill their crews, shoot down their planes. But the system continued. New crews were trained in weeks. Damaged carriers were repaired in months. New aircraft rolled off production lines continuously. We faced not a navy, but an industrial machine that converted resources into combat power faster than we could destroy it. Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura, in a 1985 interview, reflected on the broader implications. The Essex-Class carriers were proof that American industrial culture had been successfully applied to military operations. Just as their factories mass-produced automobiles through assembly line processes, their carriers mass-produced combat sorties through systematic procedures. We Japanese valued craftsmanship, the sword maker who spent months perfecting a blade. Americans valued efficiency, the factory that produced 1,000 acceptable blades per day. In peacetime, both approaches have merit. In war, efficiency wins. The Americans didn't need perfect carrier operations. They needed high-volume, reliable operations, and they engineered systems that delivered exactly that. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, speaking at a 1992 symposium on Pacific War naval aviation, addressed the intelligence failures that prevented Japan from understanding what they faced. We knew Americans were building Essex-Class carriers. We observed their size and aircraft capacity, but we never imagined they had fundamentally redesigned carrier operations. We assumed bigger carriers meant more of the same. We failed to understand they had revolutionized the entire concept. This failure wasn't from lack of intelligence collection. We had detailed specifications of Essex-Class carriers by 1943. What we lacked was imagination to conceive that carrier aviation could be systematized to that degree. We couldn't imagine it because we had never thought to try it ourselves.
The numbers tell the story of American carrier supremacy with brutal clarity. Sortie generation comparison, per carrier per day. Japanese fleet carrier, 40 to 45 sorties maximum. Essex-Class carrier, 120 to 140 sorties sustained, 160-plus surge capability. Launch rate comparison. Japanese fleet carrier, 20 to 25 aircraft per 30 minutes, optimal conditions. Essex-Class carrier, 35 to 40 aircraft per 15 minutes, combat conditions. Aircraft recovery rates. Japanese fleet carrier, 15 to 18 aircraft per hour. Essex-Class carrier, 30 to 35 aircraft per hour. Operational cycle times. Japanese carrier, launch, recover, rearm, and launch, 120 to 150 minutes. Essex-Class, same cycle, 70 to 90 minutes. Task Force 58 Performance Statistics, 1944 to 1945. Total carriers, 15 to 17, varying by operation. Total combat sorties, 128,000 plus. Average daily sortie rate, 450 to 600. Peak single-day rate, 1,200 plus sorties, Okinawa campaign. Average turnaround time, 75 minutes. Aircraft availability rate, 85 to 90%. Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19 through 20th, 1944. American carriers launched 890 sorties over 36 hours. Japanese carriers launched 450 sorties over 48 hours. American sortie generation rate 24.7 per hour. Japanese sortie generation rate 9.4 per hour. Combat loss ratios. Japanese aircraft destroyed 645. American aircraft destroyed 123. Ratio 5.2 to 1 in favor of Americans. The statistics reveal that American victory wasn't achieved through slight margins, but through overwhelming systematic superiority. Essex-Class carriers could generate nearly 3 times the combat sorties of Japanese carriers and sustain those rates indefinitely due to superior damage control, maintenance systems, and pilot replacement programs. 1954 present. Lessons applied to modern Japanese naval aviation. When Japan established the Maritime Self-Defense Force (MSDF) in 1954,
former Imperial Navy officers applied lessons learned from facing American carriers. The MSDF's approach to carrier-based aviation directly reflected American influence. Vice Admiral Saburo Nakano, retired from the MSDF in 1970, wrote extensively about how American carrier doctrine shaped Japanese thinking. "We built our helicopter carriers and later our Izumo-class destroyers with American principles in mind: systematic procedures over individual expertise, redundant systems for damage control, optimized deck layouts for aircraft flow, training programs based on manuals rather than apprenticeship. More fundamentally, we adopted the American philosophical approach: maximize operational tempo through engineering and organization. When we designed the Izumo, every system was evaluated for its impact on aircraft operations. We didn't ask, how do we build a traditional carrier? We asked, how do we maximize sortie generation within our defensive mission?" The MSDF's deck crew training program, established in 1964, was directly modeled on American carrier procedures. Color-coded personnel roles, systematic movement patterns, detailed procedural manuals, and continuous process optimization all reflected lessons learned from Essex-Class carriers. American occupation authorities shared their carrier doctrine with us, noted Admiral Takeshi Yamamoto in a 1988 interview. They were confident their superiority came not from secrets, but from systematic application of engineering principles. They believed, correctly, that even if we understood their methods, implementing them required cultural and organizational changes that take decades.
June 1994, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Philippine Sea, surviving veterans from both sides gathered at Pearl Harbor for a reconciliation symposium. Among the attendees were 12 former Japanese naval aviators who had faced American carriers in combat. The symposium featured technical presentations on carrier operations, allowing Japanese veterans to finally understand the systems that had defeated them. American historians displayed detailed diagrams of Essex-Class carrier deck operations, launch procedures, and organizational structures. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Nakano, then 78 years old, delivered a speech that summarized the Japanese experience. "For 50 years, I have studied American carrier operations, trying to understand what we faced. Today, seeing these detailed presentations, I finally comprehend the full magnitude of what the Essex-Class carriers represented. We believed carrier aviation was about elite pilots and aggressive tactics. Americans proved it was about systems engineering and operational tempo. We thought we were fighting other pilots. We were actually fighting an industrial system optimized for sustained combat operations." The Essex-Class carriers weren't just ships. They were integrated weapons systems designed from the beginning to maximize sortie generation. Every component, from elevator speed to fuel line placement to crew training methods, was optimized for one purpose: putting aircraft into combat faster and more sustainably than any opponent could match. We never had a chance. Not because American pilots were better, though they were well trained. Not because American aircraft were superior, though they were excellent. We never had a chance because they had engineered a system that generated 3 times our combat power from equivalent resources. In warfare, that advantage is insurmountable. Flight Officer Hiroshi Takano added his reflection: "What haunts me still is the realization that we knew we were losing, but couldn't understand why. We saw our pilots dying in increasing numbers. We watched our carriers being sunk. We experienced defeat after defeat, but we attributed it to numbers, or luck, or spirit. We never understood that we faced systematic organizational superiority. The Americans had solved carrier aviation like engineers solve problems, by identifying every inefficiency and optimizing every process. They didn't need exceptional individuals. They needed reliable systems, and they built them. To the Americans who defeated us, you won not through hatred or vengeance,
but through superior thinking about how to organize military power. You taught us, through the harsh teacher of combat, that systematic excellence defeats individual excellence. That lesson rebuilt Japanese naval aviation on sound principles. For that, we thank you.
Commander Shigeru Nishimura, who survived the war and later became a respected naval historian, published his final assessment of American carrier operations in 1996, shortly before his death. His conclusions summarized 50 years of study. The Essex-Class carrier represented the culmination of American industrial culture applied to naval warfare. Everything Americans were good at, mass production, process optimization, systematic training, engineering solutions to operational problems, was incorporated into carrier design and operations. Japanese carriers were built by a culture that valued craftsmanship and elite skill. American carriers were built by a culture that valued efficiency and systematic procedure. Both approaches work in peacetime. In war, systematic efficiency wins. We faced not better sailors, but better systems. Not superior courage, but superior organization. Not greater determination, but greater engineering. The Americans mechanized what we kept artisanal. They systematized what we kept personal. They optimized what we left traditional. The lesson for naval warfare is clear. In modern combat, organizational capability matters more than individual skill. The force that can generate more combat power per resource input through better systems, better training, better organization will win regardless of courage or tradition. Essex-class carriers could launch 100 aircraft in minutes, not because they were larger, but because every aspect of their design and operation was optimized for that capability. That optimization, that systematic thinking, that engineering approach to military operations, that was the American secret weapon. And it was never really secret. It was simply how they thought.
To modern carrier operations. The U.S. Navy's Nimitz and Ford-class supercarriers are direct descendants of Essex-class design philosophy. Maximize sortie generation through systematic optimization of every component and process. The color-coded deck crew jerseys are still worn. The systematic procedures for aircraft launch and recovery are still followed. The emphasis on redundant systems and damage control still guides design. The training methods that create reliable teams, rather than depending on individual expertise, still define carrier crew preparation. Former Japanese naval officers who studied American carriers carried those lessons into the Maritime Self-Defense Force, where they influenced Japanese naval aviation for generations. Modern Japanese helicopter carriers and the Izumo-class vessels reflect American organizational principles adapted to Japanese defensive missions. The veterans who survived their encounters with Essex-class carriers maintained their perspective throughout their lives. They had witnessed not just tactical defeat, but systematic outclassing, the confrontation between craftsmanship and industrial efficiency, between elite skill and organizational excellence, between tradition and systematic innovation. Their testimony stands as recognition that victory in modern warfare comes not from courage alone, but from the integration of courage with superior systems, better organization, and the systematic application of engineering thinking to military problems. The Essex-class carriers proved that in the industrial age, the force that best systematizes its operations will prevail. That lesson, learned at terrible cost by Japanese naval aviators in 1944-1945, remains valid in modern warfare. They faced not just superior ships, but superior thinking about how military power should be organized and employed. That intellectual advantage, translated into steel and procedure and training, created carriers that could launch 100 aircraft in minutes, a capability that seemed impossible until it became routine. The Japanese pilots who witnessed it never forgot.
Their testimony ensured the lessons would endure, that systematic excellence defeats individual excellence, that organization matters more than heroism, and that in warfare, the best engineered system wins.